Welcome everyone. My name is Mary Jane McKitterick and I am the Community Planning Manager with Away Home Canada. Welcome to the 7th in a series of webinars from Away Home designed to increase knowledge and capacity on youth homelessness, community planning. Our focus today is the new protection services for 16 and 17-year-old youth in Ontario and the impacts and opportunities for youth service providers. I would like to take the time to just change the slide here, just a second. There we go. I'd like to take the time to thank the Government of Ontario for their generous support of this webinar series and their commitment to increasing the capacity of communities to prevent and end youth homelessness. There we go. I'd also like to acknowledge in this series a partnership with the Ontario Ministry of Children and Youth, the Ontario Municipal Social Services Association, and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and a special thank you to Naveen from the COH today for all your support, for helping us set this up. Let's just see here. Okay, so Away Home Canada is a national coalition of partners that are dedicated to preventing and ending youth homelessness in Canada. We use a collective impact approach for organizing, and we bring together key players that touch on youth homelessness from across and within nonprofit, private, and public sectors to align our resources and efforts around youth homelessness, and you can see some of the partners on this slide. So details about our coalition, our partners, etc., and all the recordings, everything will be available on our website, and we have a ton of resources. I'll just check in with you in a moment about it. So our presenters today are I'd like to welcome very much. The first is Lori Bennett, Manager at the Child Welfare Secretariat, Ontario Ministry of Children and Youth Services. She's with the Child Welfare Secretariat, which is the policy branch for child welfare. Lori joined the Secretariat in September of 2016 after a 22-year career in child welfare practice. She has a Master of Social Work degree from the University of Calgary and a Bachelor of Social Work degree from Memorial University in Newfoundland. David French has 20 years of experience working with Alberta's most vulnerable young people. He led the development of the plan to prevent and end youth homelessness in that province. He supported its implementation across 10 communities, and David has taken a leave from the Government of Alberta to support Away Home's national efforts as Director of Policy and Planning. He is a firm believer in harnessing the strength and leadership of community and voices, and especially the experiences of young people, in helping to shape effective and long-lasting policy. We have just a slight delay in our slides as we change them here. Just give another click. Sorry. Okay, there we go. I'd like to just go over our agenda. I'm going to take about 5 minutes to just introduce the webinar series and Away Home's resources. Many of you will have seen these before, but some may not. So we'll just take a couple minutes to go over that. Then Lori will introduce the new protection services for 16 and 17-year-olds and outline how they impact youth service providers. So that's the main focus here. But David will also set the context for that work within the youth homelessness sector and how this new legislation aligns with our youth homelessness prevention work. Following that, we'll have time for questions. That's not on the agenda, but it is. We will. We'll have about a good half an hour for that. So there we go. So just a quick run through some of our community planning resources. We've been supporting youth homelessness across Canada since 2013, and we've been continuing to develop the resources and support that impact the broadest number of communities possible. So here's just a few things to keep in mind as we move forward. If you haven't had a chance to read our Youth Homelessness Community Planning Toolkit, please access it. It's all over our website. And if you have any questions about this or need support with it, please contact me. This webinar series, and also the webinar series, is our key element this year to increasing the capacity of communities to do this work. We give access to content experts and deeper dives into topics covered in the toolkit, as well as trying to address some of the emerging trends and issues that are coming through. So please also join our online community of practice. This is hosted by the Homeless Hub at workspacehomelessness.ca. There's the link there. And these links, by the way, will be embedded in the presentation, the PDF that will be available after this webinar. So don't worry if you can't copy all this down now. And finally, you can access our mailing list to be updated on all of these things through our website or through this link. Bit of a delay there, sorry, I'm just clicking again. Oh, come on. Ooh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. There, okay, thank you. So just a quick review of our webinar series. You can see we've already had 6. This is our 7th, and there are some of the topics. The first 3 were on sort of fundamentals of community planning, and they really helped to build up those skills. The last 3 have been a real focus on research and data management, because that was something that emerged last year as a big topic that folks needed that technical support with. And all of those webinars are on our website, and you can take a look at those. We're going to be planning future ones for 2018, a big focus on systems planning, systems integration, regional planning, government policy, and many others, but we also welcome any input into emerging trends, things that you're having issues with, so please feel free to contact us for that. So I always like to just come back to our resources. We have many. Here's a sampling as soon as this slide moves forward. Sorry. Come on, you. There we go. Just a quick glance at all the covers. There's many, many more. You can find these all on our website. There's the toolkits front and center, and we have, human rights, policy briefs, program model guides, webinar series, you name it. We have it for you. So please avail yourself of those resources, and we continue to add them. So now I'm really happy to let Lori Bennett take over now, and I welcome you, Lori. Thanks so much for providing this important information for us.
Thank you, Mary Jane, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We appreciate the opportunity to share this piece of information that we're talking about today. Just going to wait a second for the slides to catch up with me. Okay, so our purpose today is to provide information for all of you about protection services that will become available on January 1st, 2018. And the new service is for a specific cohort of youth. They are 16 and 17-year-olds in the province who are or who may be in need of protection. And when we say that, when we talk about being in need of protection, we're referring to youth who may be experiencing physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, or risk of harm, or at risk of any of these things. And so we've designed this presentation for community partners who support youth and who are in a position to refer youth who are or who may be in need of protection to children's aid societies, including Indigenous societies. Before getting into the specific service, it makes some sense to give you a little bit of background about how child protection services are delivered in Ontario. As you may or may not be aware, child protection or child welfare services are provincially mandated, so each province will have a slightly different structure about how they deliver services. The legislation is also provincial legislation. So in Ontario specifically, children's aid societies and Indigenous child well-being societies have the exclusive mandate under the Child and Family Services Act to provide child protection services. And when we talk about children's aid societies, they are independent legal entities, nonprofit corporations run by volunteer boards or directors, or in one case, an Indian band operating under the Indian Act. And these societies are accountable to the communities they serve. The Ministry of Children and Youth Services has a supervisory and oversight role with respect to the child welfare system, but it is societies who provide direct service, and they're mandated to investigate allegations of abuse and or neglect, protect children where necessary, provide prevention services to families, provide care for children assigned or committed to their care, supervise children assigned to their care, place children for adoption, and perform other duties as required. The Ministry of Children and Youth Services funds 38 children's aid societies in Ontario, 3 of which are faith-based and 10 are Indigenous child well-being societies to deliver child protection services in the province. These societies deliver services on a 24/7 basis, and they must investigate or intervene in a timely manner according to ministry standards. So while the ministry is responsible for the legislative and policy framework for the delivery of child welfare services, direct service delivery is by children's aid societies. And you can find your local society in your telephone listings by dialing 411, and they will sometimes have different names. They may be Children's Aid Societies, Family and Children's Services, or Child and Family Services. And I've added a link here as well that will take you to the website of the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, where they will have a listing of all societies and how they might be contacted. So to give you, before we get into the specific change, it's important to talk about the current context for 16 and 17-year-olds in this province. Currently under the CFSA, societies have the authority to provide child protection services to children under the age of 16. So once a child becomes 16, Children's Aid Societies no longer have a mandate to service them unless they were previously subject to a court order. So if the child comes into care prior to the 16th birthday and there is a court order in place, that child can receive service to 18. But if not, a child who's 16 or 17 is not eligible for service currently. Several years back, there was a service developed called the Renewed Youth Supports Program that was intended to provide services for 16 and 17-year-olds who may have been subject to a court order but left society care at 16 or 17 and then changed their minds and wanted to return for service. And while the court order may have been terminated, they could return on a voluntary basis through the Renewed Youth Supports Program and receive services through an agreement. And those youth who were in a Renewed Youth Supports Agreement, or youth who were subject to a court order, if they were in care up to 18, they would also be eligible for the Continued Care and Supports Program for youth, which would mean a range of services that would be available to 21. But all of these supports were directed to youth who had been served previous to their 16th birthday. So to get to the change, on December 8th, 2017, Bill 89, the Supporting Children, Youth and Families Act, was introduced in the House. And so that bill accomplished several things. One thing that bill will accomplish is that it will repeal and replace the Child and Family Services Act with a new act, the Child, Youth and Family Services Act. And that is anticipated to be proclaimed in the spring in April. But in the interim, the bill would also amend the current Child and Family Services Act to raise the age of protection for children up to age 18, prior to the proclamation of the CFSA. So while there will be a new act replacing the current act, in the short term, the age of protection is being raised in the current act. And those changes are expected to be proclaimed on January 1st, 2018. So once we tabled the bill, the ministry began the work of developing a service delivery approach that would be communicated to societies through a policy directive. So the goal of a policy directive advisory committee was to establish service requirements and to communicate those to societies in a policy directive. And that advisory committee was comprised of representatives from the child welfare sector. There were several youth serving agencies, other community service providers. Provincial advocate was there, and other government representatives that all took part in the advisory committee. And that committee met between March and May and provided recommendations to the ministry on both the guiding principles, the underlying philosophical approach to the service delivery model, and also the requirements for societies for each level of service, beginning from the time that a youth is referred for service until final service to the youth, until service is complete, including a new voluntary agreement, which I will speak to in detail in a little while. And in addition to the advisory committee, there was a significant period of broader engagement, both for the legislative changes and for the policy directive. And I've listed several of them there, but and I won't read them to you, but the member agencies for Children's Aid Societies were consulted regularly. Several groups of youth were consulted. The Minister's Working Group, the Child Welfare Partnership Table, Provincial Advocate, the Office of Children's Lawyer, the Ontario Association of Residences Treating Youth. And in addition to those, in March 2017, the ministry funded and attended Reroute, a forum on child welfare and youth homelessness. It was hosted by Covenant House, but it brought together 45 key experts and senior leaders from the child welfare, community youth housing, and academic sectors in Toronto. And its purpose was to both examine the research that was known in the field about the connection between involvement in the child welfare system and youth homelessness, and also for that group to identify some promising practices and commit to an action plan for preventing young people who have received child welfare services to prevent them from entering homelessness. So based on all of those engagements, there were several themes that emerged through that process, and those themes shaped both the guiding principles of the directive as well as the requirements. So one core theme was that we heard repeatedly, and that was the need to effectively balance a focus on youth safety with the youth autonomy and agency. Recognizing that the goal of any protection service is the safety of a youth, but also balancing that with an awareness that the best safety plan for a youth will occur when a youth is effectively engaged. So the ultimate goal is to engage and support youth in making good decisions about their own safety. A second important theme was the importance of preparation for transition to adulthood and the need to assist youth in establishing permanent relationships. There was a recognition that while the age of protection had been raised, that the 16 and 17-year-old cohort still represented a brief period of time to prepare young people for their transition to adulthood. And the third theme is the importance of connection to community and culture, and specifically the role that these connections play in stabilizing youth and in establishing permanent relationships for the youth and contributing to good outcomes. So without further ado, I'm going to take you through some of the core aspects of the directive. The directive was issued to societies on October 13th, and it sets additional requirements, or additional to the requirements that are established in the Act. It sets additional requirements for the delivery of child protection services to 16 and 17-year-olds. The policy will come into effect on the same day that the amendments to the Act are expected to be proclaimed. And the directive requires all societies to provide the full range of child protection services to youth until their 18th birthday, and also including society agreements with 16 and 17-year-olds under Section 37.1 of the Act. And we refer to those agreements as voluntary youth services agreements, or VISAs, in the directive. And that's how I will describe them here, as a VISA. So there were 6 different guiding principles that were developed by the advisory committee and that informed the service approach, and I will go through each of them individually. Youth-centered protection service. Youth receiving service may have experienced traumatic events or circumstances. Societies will actively engage the youth in decision-making and promote the youth's voluntary participation in service, assisting the youth to build on their strengths and address the protection issues that are impacting them. Wherever possible, service should support youth to make decisions that help to minimize risk and promote their best interests, protection, and well-being. Least disruptive approach is the second principle. Youth are often best supported within their families, extended families, and communities. Service should favor the least disruptive course of action to protect the youth. Service should promote the involvement of families, extended families, and communities in decision-making about the youth's safety and well-being where appropriate. Permanency. Youth who are 16 or 17 are beginning the transition to independence, and societies will engage them to identify their permanency goals. Service should support the youth in identifying and developing permanent relationships that are meaningful and beneficial to the youth, and incorporate broad definitions of family, extended family, kin, and community. Connection to kin, community, and culture is another principle. Maintaining connection to kin, community, and culture are closely connected to permanency planning and positive outcomes for youth. Youth should have access to culturally appropriate services, community-based supports, and opportunities to support their self-development and connection to their cultures, heritages, traditions, and identities. Culturally appropriate services for Indigenous youth. Service to Indigenous youth should promote connections with community, culture, heritage, and traditions, and reflect holistic approaches and support Indigenous youth to remain connected with family, extended family, and communities. And finally, diversity. Individuals are unique, and service should be responsive to the diversity of youth and families served, and be provided from an anti-oppression and anti-racism perspective. So with these principles in mind, I'm going to move to reviewing some of the elements of the service approach. As you can imagine, there's fairly detailed requirements for societies that won't be, that are very, I guess, field specific, so I won't go into detail on every requirement, but I do want to highlight several of the significant pieces of the service approach. First is with respect to reporting suspicions that a youth may be in need of protection. One piece of advice that we received from the Policy Directive Advisory Committee was with respect to reporting requirements and making sure that the community understood how concerns could be reported about a 16 or 17-year-old. In Ontario, the Child and Family Services Act requires reporting in any situation where a child there is suspicion that a child is in need of protection. And it applies to children under 16. That is the current duty to report, as we refer to it in Ontario. There is a higher level of expectation for professionals who, through their course of involvement with a child, becomes aware or becomes suspicious of an issue of child maltreatment. But with the new legislation, with amendments to the Act, the duty to report, as we have traditionally known it, will not apply to 16 and 17-year-olds. So the current duty will still remain in place for children who are under 16, but a 16 or 17-year-old is not subject to the duty to report. However, a community member or a professional member of the public or the youth themselves may make a report about a 16 or 17-year-old, and the society will be expected to respond to that report in the way that they would respond to any report that is received, but the duty to report doesn't apply to the older cohort of youth. And this specific direction it takes into consideration that a different approach is required for 16 and 17-year-olds that will protect them while also encouraging their voluntary participation in service. We heard from several stakeholder groups concerns that if there was a mandated duty to report for this group of youth, and if youth feared being referred to a society and losing control of their situation, that they may be reluctant to engage various services that they might need. So they might be reluctant to seek out a shelter, or a young woman might be reluctant to seek out services if she was in a violent relationship, and those sorts of things. So we didn't want reporting to be a disincentive for youth to seek out services that they need. A closely related issue is the grounds for protection. We've referred to youth being in need of protection, and so to explain that a little bit, the Child and Family Services Act has a section that describes the definition of a child in need of protection. In child welfare circles, we refer to these as the grounds for protection. And these grounds include physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, neglect, risk of harm. And so these grounds would apply to this new cohort of youth. The same grounds that exist for children up to 16 will apply to this older cohort of youth, the same descriptions of a child in need of protection. And some have raised questions around, what about a youth who is withdrawn from parental control, is no longer living with a parent? And what we would say to that is that a youth who has left their parents' care, who is 16 or 17, is not necessarily in need of protection for that reason alone, but there may have been protection concerns that led to that withdrawal from the parent's care. So those are issues that would be considered by society. The other thing I would add is that the amendments include a new provision that allows for us to come back at a later date. If we find that the current grounds for protection are not sufficient for this particular group of youth, then at a later date we can come back and develop a regulation adding new grounds. At this time, there won't be any new grounds added, but if at some point in the future we desire to do that, then we can. Some have raised the question around whether youth participation in service is voluntary, and as we noted, a key principle of the directive is youth-centered protection service. And we would say that wherever possible, service delivered to youth who are 16 and 17 should support these youth to make decisions that help to minimize risk and promote their best interests, protection, and well-being. So we've talked about how a report is made, and I just want to speak to how reports will be investigated. When a society receives a report, they will apply the Ontario Child Protection Standards and the Ontario Child Welfare Eligibility Spectrum in the way that they would to any case. And where it's appropriate, they will conduct an investigation to determine whether a youth is in need of protection. And the advice from the advisory committee is that the current standards with respect to investigations are flexible enough to work for this particular group of youth. And the standards have something that we call clinical departures. And when we talk about clinical departures, what we mean is that there may be some situations where a specific portion of a standard might not best serve the child or youth in question. And this applies to younger children as well, that if there is a situation where a specific portion of the standard is not appropriate, then a supervisor can approve a departure from that particular standard. And so what the advisory committee felt was that there may be situations with youth where clinical departures might be appropriate. For example, there may be a situation where there's been a parent-child separation and the parents have essentially refuse to have the youth return to their home and may be refusing involvement. This should not be an impediment for societies to be involved with the youth and to make a determination about that youth's needs. And in that case, that would be an appropriate clinical departure. Likewise, specific questions have been raised about circumstances such as an unaccompanied minor, youth who have been released from a youth justice facility and cannot return home. In these types of situations, society will consider each case on its own merits and make a determination about whether the youth is in need of protection. There are some differences for this group with respect to admissions to care. A 16 or 17-year-old may not be apprehended without their consent. So with younger children, a society can apprehend a child with a warrant or without a warrant, and then within 5 days they have to present before a court to make a case as to why that child was removed and to present a plan for the child. Apprehension, as is known for younger children, does not apply to 16 and 17-year-olds. However, if a society is concerned about a youth and that youth is not willing to enter a voluntary youth services agreement, the society does have the option to make an application to court to determine whether that youth is in need of protection, and the court will hear the evidence of the society and consider the youth's position before making a decision about that youth's admission. And in situations where there is imminent risk, an emergency application may be considered by the society, but in any event it would be an application to court and the youth would attend as a party and be able to give evidence. A temporary care agreement is an agreement between, it's an option under the Act currently. That's an agreement between the society and a parent for a child's admission to care. Under the current Act, any child under 12 has to also sign that agreement and be willing to come into care voluntarily unless there are concerns about that child's capacity. This type of agreement is also a legal option for youth, but if an agreement is an option, certainly the voluntary youth services agreement should be considered for its appropriateness first. Notification of the children's lawyer is a significant part of this directive. When a society has determined that a youth is in need of protection and they're considering a VISA, a kinship service placement, which is a placement with family or kin, a temporary care agreement, as we just discussed, or seeking a court order to bring the youth into society's care, they are required to make a referral to the Office of the Children's Lawyer. And that the OCL may provide representation to the youth who is entering a VISA. Youth who were consulted expressed strongly their need for access to legal supports and other forms of support prior to making a decision to enter a VISA. So the referral to the OCL is a policy requirement so that the youth can have legal advice and get information from a third party about the legal options that are available at any time that a society is considering an out-of-home placement of one of the 4 options that we just spoke to. The youth also has the option to consult the provincial advocate or any other trusted adult or advocate that they may wish to speak with, or to have those individuals attend planning meetings. So I want to speak to the voluntary youth services agreements, and again, I'm going to speak to the agreements and the plan that accompanies them. I'm not going to go into these slides in detail because they're more specific details for societies who will carry them out, but I want to give you a sense of what these look like. First of all, the eligibility requirements for a visa. First of all, they apply to 16 and 17-year-olds, and the eligibility criteria are as follows. The society has jurisdiction where the youth resides. So essentially, in Ontario, societies are given geographical jurisdiction. They may be given jurisdiction based on, if they're faith-based agencies, based on the identified faith of the child, and there would also be jurisdictional concerns with respect to Indigenous identity. So the society has to have jurisdiction where the youth resides. The society has determined that a youth is or may be in need of protection. The society is satisfied that no course of action less disruptive to the youth, such as care in the youth's own home or with a relative, neighbor, or other member of the youth's community or extended family member, is able to adequately protect the youth, and the youth wants to enter into the agreement. So it is a voluntary agreement, and those criteria must be met prior to an agreement between the society and the youth. Questions are sometimes raised about the role of families, and we would still strongly affirm the role of families in these situations. Youth are often best supported at home with their families, extended families, and communities, and service should favor the least disruptive course of action to protect the youth. The visa is an agreement between a youth and a society. The parents aren't signatories to the agreement unless if the youth was strongly expressing a desire to have the parents sign. This would not be an impediment as such, but the visa is an agreement between the youth and the society, and the parent's consent is not required for the youth to enter a visa. And this does not prohibit the parent from being involved in supporting the youth. In fact, societies will continue to encourage parental involvement where that's appropriate. Just to speak to the term of the visa briefly, a visa can be any term up to 12 months and can be renewed for a total term that doesn't exceed 24 months or continue beyond the 18th birthday. And the other point that's important to make is that if a youth is in a visa at the time of their 18th birthday, they're also eligible to receive continued care and support for youth, so to enter a CCSY agreement and receive supports to their 21st birthday and be eligible for a full range of extended care supports. One of the core features of the visa is that the youth will have a safe living arrangement. And so the society will work with youth to develop a plan and secure an appropriate living arrangement that will best meet the youth's needs, is informed by the youth's wishes, and is appropriate to the youth's development and readiness for independence. And so this might include, if the youth is open to it, it might still include a foster home or a group home, but it might also include things such as a transitional living program where youth might be learning skills to become a good tenant and to live independently. And it might also include supported independent living if that's appropriate for that particular youth. There's a series of notifications, information to be provided, referrals to be made before a youth can enter a visa. I won't read these to you, but it's important that the youth be informed about the voluntary nature, be given an opportunity to consult a lawyer and appropriate advocates. Also, in the case of a First Nations youth, to provide notification to a representative chosen by the youth band or Native community, and also the referral to the OCL as we discussed. There is a complaints and conflict resolution portion to the requirements for societies. Societies are required to inform youth about their complaints processes, about options to resolve conflict. And the requirement includes that they be informed about these processes and procedures at several junctures in the life of their involvement with the society. And every youth who enters a visa will have a voluntary youth services plan. It will be completed within 30 days of signing the visa and updated at least once every 6 months. And it will need to be reviewed once every 3 months. So that requirement means it's to be reviewed in person at least once every 3 months. So that means that there will be minimally quarterly contact between the society and the youth. But the frequency of contact can be determined at a higher frequency if that's agreeable to the youth and the society. There are several, the requirements include what must be included in the plan, and there's a list of things that the society must consider here. Again, I won't read them to you, but there's a list of things that the society must be considering and speak to these issues within the plan for the youth. The plan will also have to include the financial and social supports, various roles and responsibilities. And there's a specific requirement that the plan include how the society is going to help the youth transition to adulthood and independence. So what items are in place, what activities are in place to help the youth prepare for that transition. And it will also include a reference to the eligibility for CCSY upon their 18th birthday if they're still in the agreement, and to receive that support until their 21st birthday. For some next steps, the ministry will continue to work with partners as we prepare for implementation, which is expected to occur on January 1st. The proclamation date has been set for January 1st, and so we anticipate that societies will go live with providing service to children and youth youth who are 16 and 17, effective January 1. So that's the extent of my presentation at this point, and will be available for some questions later on after David has presented.
Excellent. Thank you, Lori. And again, yeah, thanks for everybody for joining us today. I specifically want to thank Lori and her team for taking us and walking us through that. It is an important element of this work that we continue to articulate around the need for prevention activities within the youth homelessness spectrum of supports. And so the time and care that you've taken to build this out shows. You know, we can really see where your balanced approach to the review was taken. You know, the important elements and notes around preparing young people for transitioning to adulthood. I love the fact that you talk about broad definitions of family and supports for young people. And, you know, a real focus on supports for Indigenous young people and diverse young people. You know, that in itself is music to our ears, and it shows the cross-section of our work and where our work really aligns. And so I'm just waiting for my slide to move along. Waiting. While we're waiting, I'm gonna focus, you know, a bunch of my time on data, which is fun for me. I also focus some of my time on where we feel we need to be going with respect to broader partnerships with child intervention and the youth serving sector, and so I'll start with this picture that we've been provided. You know, thanks to our funders, Home Depot Foundation Canada, for leading the work and supporting our work around the national survey, which was released last year. And I talk about the survey a lot, and I talk about it in the sense that it has given us a brand new opportunity for dialogue with stakeholders and with our government partners. You know, there was for a long time, and, you know, even it still persists, but in lots of ways, people would look at the youth homelessness situation and say, we don't have the data to really inform why we should target our responses to meet the unique needs of young people. Well, we can't say that anymore. And I say that being a former bureaucrat and being in that position where we looked for good data and tried to pull information to really suggest and justify why we needed a youth homelessness response. The national survey has been a game changer with respect to that conversation nationally. And that work has translated into these pockets of specific briefs that are driving at these more targeted issues for young people. Mental health, you've got here on the screen the child welfare brief. Plans for future briefs are coming up, but what these briefs are doing is they're further drilling down what we mean and what the data is telling us, and how that work can continue to inform our work together across government. So the Without a Home study, if you haven't memorized it by now, it listened to the voices of more than 1,100 young people from 47 communities in 10 different provinces. And that sample size did allow us to make some really clear recommendations about the work. And so what it also did was it is telling us, and more than just us, the service providers and those people on the ground level, you understand young people and you see them and you know who they are. And unfortunately, what we need sometimes to inform more strategic and high-level responses is that data. So we're able to pull out of that the real picture of young people, why they're becoming homeless, and the interventions that are required to ensure their homeless experience is brief and non-reoccurring. The data from the Without a Home survey has also allowed us to begin to tailor our programmatic responses and work with communities specifically who are looking to target specific populations. For example, Indigenous young people or young people who identify as LGBTQ2S, or in the context of this conversation, young people transitioning from the child intervention system. I work really closely with our child intervention system in Alberta when we were designing the plan in Alberta. And what it told us was that we were in a place to really refine our response. And what I hope that the work in Ontario continues to percolate is these broader partnerships that are needing to happen, really build out this response to, or build out this prevention piece that you've already talked about. I hope can't see who's on the webinar, but I hope some of our partners from the Ministry of Housing are on the webinar, because what I'm looking at with the work that you've done, Lori, is I'm looking at a really strong component of the prevention theme that should be embedded within a provincial strategy. The high-level story around child intervention within the Without a Home study, and as we built out the others, is 51.1% of the young people we surveyed reported physical abuse or as a child. 24% reported experiencing sexual abuse. 63.1% of the young people in our sample experienced childhood trauma or abuse, so that we can make those assumptions that a large percentage of those young people were involved in child intervention. And on average, we were seeing that involvement with child intervention within the survey respondents was 31% had experience before the age of 6. So that tells us that we have a long story with respect to the sector and the system. And again, it's one of those opportunities for us to say we know who these young people are who are potentially at risk of homelessness. And so one of the things that I often say to our partners in Alberta is you only have a real sense of who transitions appropriately because they're often land in other systems. And so what we want to do is we want to ensure that if those young people do land in those systems, there's that we've created the bridge for them into those systems so they feel supported and nurtured. The findings from Without a Home really focused our actions within the Child Welfare Policy Brief on 4 fairly distinct actions and responses that we need to consider moving forward. And the work that we did with Dr. Nichols and Caitlin Schwann and Dr. Gates Dr. Sean Kidd and Dr. Bill O'Grady, they really helped shape where we felt in partnership with child intervention we could go. I'm still hearing some echo.
Yep, I'm hearing it too. I'm just editing the audio mode to see if we can fix that.
Test. I think that seems to work. Oh.
Yeah, it's a little bit better, but it's not.
Yeah, Naveen, it sounded like someone joined by phone. There was a ring, and then after that, the echo kicked in.
I'm going to take off people who are on the phone.
Are we okay to pause here? I'll just get started with the solution it.
Sorry, yeah, no one's on here that should be causing an echo. I'm just going to mute everyone else. All right. How's it now?
Hello?
Oh, it's still echoing. All right, sorry, David. I'm just going to mute you for 1 second.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry, everyone. Is this better, MJ? All right, David, let me know if this is better or if this sounds less echoey.
Okay. There's still an echo, but I can proceed if we can solution.
I think the best bet is to go ahead. Thank you so much.
Okay. So the four distinct areas of concern that we identified was that we were seeing young people with a level of instability within their housing and their child intervention experiences. They were articulating that the transitions from child intervention were challenging, and they had early experience of homelessness if they would transition out of child intervention. And we also felt like we were hearing from young people that they felt like an inequity around the services and supports that were being provided. And so that's what framed our recommendations within the Child Welfare Policy Brief. There are elements that we feel, and again, Lori and the ministry have gone into some of these things that we feel are what needs to be different for young people. And you've articulated them already, and so I won't belabor the point, but equity and human rights are a huge component of this, and you throughout your presentation, Lori, you talk about choice and voice and listening to young people's wishes, and those are the pieces that really sort of show the relationship between the youth sector, or the youth homelessness serving sector, and child intervention. That's how these organizations are operating. That is certainly the framing and the thinking around our Housing First for Youth principles. And so I see some continued opportunity for us to share those learnings around Housing First for Youth and housing and stability for young people and child intervention. So I guess that's a plug for future partnerships. You also really focused on positive youth development within the adjustments and the amendments, and I think that's an important place as well to focus our efforts. In that, you know, young people, even at the age of 18, aren't necessarily ready for adulthood, but what can we do to help build those systems around them? The systems response that we need to design around this work is complicated and tangly, and to use our Newfoundland partners term, and cumbersome. And I would say that partnerships with child intervention with the youth homeless serving sector will yield the most positive results, but they're probably the most challenging to get started and kick started and understand where they're all at. We, as we've said, we need to invest in homelessness prevention, which you've done, which is a component of this work that we need to do, and youth participation and innovation within this work. And you've already demonstrated where youth participation has yielded excellent outcomes within the amendments. And so I'm keen to see how that continues for your work, how young people continue to be engaged in the review and in the implementation. And maybe that's a question that respondents have asked already. How will young people continue to be engaged? But I'd be interested in Lori's thoughts on that. So the strength in legislation has, for me, has done a number of things. It offers additional stability for young people, specifically around, as you drill down further around these components around the voluntary youth service agreements and how that moves into the CCSY agreements. One of the questions I have is, where is the choice and voice around moving from a youth service agreement into a CCSY agreement? Are young people totally in control of how they would transition, or is that a shared responsibility? So if you're writing your questions down, Lori, that's one of them I have. The emphasis that you're placing on the materials, social supports that are necessary for young people to be ready to transition are very important. The time that you're listening to those wishes for young people, I love the word, tells us that this idea of family for yourselves and for them is up for discussion. And that's so important as we look to build out those natural supports for young people and really emphasize that they're in control. The shift in legislation also, for me, paints a really important picture for future ministerial department and program alignment. With an age jump to 18, I think that does bridge better systems together, and so those tangly conversations maybe will become a little less tangly around how to bridge young people leaving child intervention to adult systems. And what it also is doing, and I would suspect, is creating more comprehensive access to supports and education attainment, skills development, and maybe access to post-secondary institutions or readiness. That I think is really important for us to continue to move these young people along this continuum of supports, so they don't continue to access systems in the future. So for me, when I look at the amendments, I think about what's next. And I've talked already about housing, and I feel like there is this natural partnership that should exist around the principles for Housing First for Youth and the principles for how young people access and maintain housing within child intervention. We have some work that's percolating in Ontario around Making the Shift project, where we're testing the idea of Housing First for Youth for young people who've left child intervention, and so those are going to be important learnings. I do feel like we need to begin to have the conversation around harm reduction and what that means as a department and as a government. We know that working with young people who are high risk and inherently engage in high risk behaviors, we need to be embedding a harm reduction response and supports for those young people, and that's an important next step for, again, how our systems align. Back to the comment I made around, we don't really know how good a job we've done of transitioning young people. We sometimes only hear about how bad a job we've done. And so data integration and harmonization are really important. And common assessments for young people transitioning are really important as well, because that does create this better bridge between the a government system and a community system that are inherently going to happen, and how do we better support that. And then these changes, again, open us up to an opportunity to have better conversations around community planning. You know, you've articulated ways that you're going to work to, you haven't used the word homelessness, but you've referenced it in many ways about how you want to ensure young people enter into adulthood appropriately. And that means, that's homeless prevention for me. And so I think these changes really do strengthen how we plan at the community level and how we work with child intervention to ensure that young people don't enter into homelessness after they've been transitioned. Next slide. And you know, as I wrap up, I feel like I blasted through some of those recommendations and some of those policy responses, but I am back. I do want to really commend the ministry and the Ontario government for taking the opportunity to have this dialogue with us. It's not an easy dialogue to have, because I think whenever changes are made to legislation, there probably could have been many more changes, but this is a big step forward, in my opinion, for Ontario. It's a big step forward for young people who are at risk of homelessness, and it's a big step forward for how we proceed together in shaping what our community system should look like. So appreciate your time and look forward to questions.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. Yeah. Now your echo left, and I think mine is now echoing. Are you okay there? Or? Hello?
Hi. So I think this is going to sound terrible, but I think I've narrowed down to who might be the culprit. Lori, I think it's something happened with your line. The minute I muted you, it seemed to work, and I apologize that it's one of our panelists. So what I'll do is we'll take some questions if everyone wants to type in the chat box their questions. Again, the chat box is just in the bottom left corner. If you have any questions for Lori or David or MJ, let us know. In the meantime, I'm going to mute myself and see if I can get Lori, if you can go off speakerphone, and let's try to work, see if that's better.
Yeah. I think Lori is going to need to answer a lot of the questions. So
yeah, so if you can go off speakerphone, then that would be perfect.
Okay, great. I think,
awesome.
Okay, well, thank you, Naveen. I appreciate all this work behind this.
No worries.
And thank you, David, for enduring that. Actually, it's pretty impressive to hear you keep talking through that whole and maintain your coherence. So that's wonderful. So David did have a number of questions, or a couple anyway, for Lori. So I was going to suggest that maybe they have a bit of a tete-a-tete right now for a few minutes to respond to that, and then we could go to the list of questions that are already being developed. But because we're kind of waiting for you, Lori, most of these questions are for you, to be honest. So let's see here.
I'm here.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect. So do you want to, David and Lori, do you want to just maybe review your questions and then Lori respond to them, and then I'll take you through the ones that are already listed in the chat box after that. How's that?
Sure. So I could speak to perhaps the question around transition. Why? Are you hearing me well?
Yes,
Yeah.
but something.
Okay. So the visa itself reaches to the age of 18. The CCSY agreement is for youth 18 to 21. So if a youth is in a visa at the time of their 18th birthday, they are entitled to a CCSY agreement. They don't have to end it. It's still a voluntary agreement, but there is an entitlement to the CCSY. And that entitlement portion is part of the amendments.
Cool. And then the other question I had was around ongoing engagement with young people as this implements.
I'm sorry?
About ongoing engagement with young people as you go into implementation. Young people were engaged in the process of developing the amendment, but I'm interested in seeing how maybe they're going to continue to be engaged moving forward.
Right. So we are actually in the process of developing some opportunities for engagement with youth early in the new year, sorry. And part of the purpose of that, or a significant piece of the purpose, is to review the youth brochure and to get some feedback on that. It's been attached to the webinar, but it will be, once we've heard for some youth and they've had a chance to interact with it, we will be revising it to develop it as a formal, permanent brochure. And in those engagements, I'm sure we will have plenty of opportunity to hear how they're experiencing the change, what they're hearing, and that will be the beginning of the process.
Awesome.
Wonderful. So there are a few questions already on the chat, and I'll just go through them with you. I think they are mostly towards you, Lori, but there may be some more being added now, so I'll just work my way through. Karen Ecott asks to clarify, if a youth is 16 or 17 and being physically abused at home, is there a duty to report, or is it a may report with the youth engaged in the process or not?
Okay, so the duty to report, as we have noted, and is currently legislated in the province, does not apply to 16 and 17-year-olds. A professional or member of community or the youth can make a referral. A youth can refer themselves. And the same process will be followed by the society once they receive that information. The youth's permission is not required. If someone is concerned enough, they can report with the youth or on behalf of the youth, or just make a report, and they can choose to be anonymous like any referral source. The youth may not be aware. Obviously, anytime a referred client can be engaged, that's a positive, but the youth's consent is not required.
Thank you. Marie Morrison has a couple of questions. The first one is wondering about jurisdiction that currently says, quote unquote, where resides. If youth are moving between communities, what does where resides mean? That's a good question. Thanks, Marie.
That is a very good question. So what we are trying to capture with that is, if a youth leaves home in Sudbury and moves to Hamilton and needs a place in Hamilton, and arrives at a society, it's expected that the society in Hamilton would assess the youth situation and provide service to the youth. So it's about where the youth is. Now, if a youth is already receiving service somewhere and chooses to relocate, there are currently protocols in place between societies that should govern how that transfer happens.
Right, thank you. And Marie has a follow-up, another question actually. What transitional supports currently exist or are underway to ensure youth do not exit to homelessness, whether that is at age 16 or 18? Thanks. Thanks, Marie.
So the current supports, that's a broad question. Mm-hmm. I mean, the goal of this service that we're developing is to engage the youth and to develop a plan that will be responsive to the youth's needs, so that when that youth is 18, they can enter CCSY if they want to, but whether they leave at 18 or 21, that they are prepared for adulthood. So the types of services that we imagine might be very similar to younger children in some ways. If there's counseling required, that should be available. If there are other referrals that are required in the community to respond to specific needs of the youth, then they should be available. But in addition to those, we would anticipate that societies would be working with youth to develop life skills that would help them transition. And part of that would be developing skills to be a good tenant, assistance with finding and having skills to maintain housing. A significant part of the supports would be about connections. Mm-hmm. Who are the adults in the life of this youth that will be ongoing supports, whether that's a permanent relationship with family or kin, whether it's connection to community, whether there's a professional support that's necessary, those types of supports that would help the youth as they transition. Those are that's a very general picture, but essentially the plan should be specific to the youth.
That's great, and that's that's where the youth homelessness sector can help, I think, support that. And David, did you have any, if you're there, did you have any comments on that? Because I think there might be some intersections there.
Yeah, I've got a plug. I'm gonna plug something and see where it lands. And I wouldn't say it if we hadn't had the conversation with your department already. So we've developed so when I was with the province and working with Wallrun Consulting, we developed a youth assessment and prioritization tool. And that tool, in my opinion, has the ability to be used across sectors. And so the tool, what it will do is it'll determine short-term risk of homelessness and long-term risk of homelessness. And I think using that tool or elements of that tool for transition planning processes and within the transition planning process, I think would be a really big step forward. Not only if we could use the tool and reference young people using the same data set, but also if we could share data around that transition plan. That would be a game changer. And I'm using my hands and I'm making big gestures with my hands, because that's sort of where this work excites me, is where we can work within the system and within these structures, but ensure that young people's story could follow them because their story is important, and where we can work together even pre-transition for young people to ensure that young person has the supports when they transition. You talk about natural supports, you talk about family, you talk about you talk about the wishes of young people. Whoa, that was loud.
I know.
I think that's one of those things that we could work really closely together and change the dialogue on this issue.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that. Just a quick question from Haley Murdoch-Fike. Yes, all presentations and all recordings of the webinars will be available on our website, and you'll get an email as well. There's the question on the echo. Danielle Dillon says, there's a question, our community is telling us that with the modernization of the Ontario work system, it will no longer include youth under 18, which gives us the impression that they expect all these youth will be supported by CAS. This is concerning us. Not all youth will fit with CAS and could create further youth homelessness for those youth if no financial support is available. Can someone speak to this?
I can speak to that.
Fantastic, thank you.
So I would appreciate a direct email actually with that information. It's one of the pieces that we are trying to confirm with our sister ministry around how Ontario Works will respond to 16 and 17-year-olds who are not in need of protection, but who may be in need of Ontario Works, or who may prefer to avoid a children's AIDS in the society. And we've been having discussions, and we'd like to land somewhere that is clear for the public. And so some of the misconception that's out there and some of the understanding that's out there, we would like information about that as much as possible.
Super. Okay, thank you. David, did you have anything on that one, or probably not so much?
Yeah, not so much. Other than I've been there. You know, I've been where you're at, Lori, around mixed messages at the community level, and when I developed the Advancing Futures Bursary in Alberta, there was lots of those, and so getting in front of those is important. So that's the only thing I'll add.
Okay. So there's some discussion about the echo. Still echoing. Where are we? Okay, so down here. Will there be changes in the opportunity for young people to stay at MCYS group homes longer? As now there seems to be a pressure to move them on once they turn 18. It seems like, sorry, my glasses are not right today. It seems like they may not feel emotionally ready, though they are chronologically required to leave.
These specific changes that I've spoken today are with respect to 16 and 17-year-olds. However, there is significant work ongoing in the ministry with respect to reviewing residential services. So there may be more clarity around these pieces going forward.
Sunaima Manon asks, just a question regarding duty to report. Can you please explain once again how duty to report does not apply to them, but they are on the grounds for protection? This was a bit confusing on my end.
So the grounds for protection, or the descriptions that a child is in need of protection, those are the reasons why someone should refer, or why a society will make a decision whether they should investigate or not. Those same just definitions apply. The difference with this cohort is that while anyone may make a report, they are not required to. The duty to report does not apply for 16 and 17-year-olds. If you are concerned, we would encourage you to make a report. We would encourage you to inform youth about services that are available to them. And we've provided some materials attached to the webinar that should be helpful with that. But the duty in terms of a legislated duty to report is with respect to children under 16.
Okay, thank you again. Sunava actually has another, just a follow-up. Can you please explain how the new provision states that CAS can come back if additional grounds are needed?
Oh, sorry, it took me a second.
Yeah, I was trying to
So we have included in the legislation a section under the grounds, section 32M, I think it is. I'm sorry, I shouldn't reference the legislation numbering. But there is a separate section that says as prescribed. What that means is that at a later date, if we learn something about the new group of youth that are presenting for service, and we believe the current grounds aren't quite adequate, then we have the option to create a regulation under the Act at that time that creates new grounds. We have not done so, and we don't intend to for January 1st. But if at a later date we want to revisit that, we can.
Wonderful, thank you. Lots of good questions here. Okay, so Amanda Booknia asks us, hi Amanda, do you anticipate larger child protection caseloads as a result of these changes? If so, how might the province ensure that societies are properly resourced and staffed, ensuring those workers are supported? How do you make sure that caseloads are low enough to be able to provide youth with the full range of supports they require as they address their housing needs without letting standards and compliance suffer for new and existing cases? It's a long question. I don't know if you can see it there, but
I don't see it, but I think I've got portions of it.
I'll take it.
With respect to the increase in numbers, we would agree there will be an increase in the number of youth that are served. And financial announcements will be made to societies with respect to that. But in terms of things such as housing, you've made a point around concerns about securing appropriate placements and so on. And this is an area where we will grow. We have identified some areas where we think we need to pay attention, and there will be efforts in the near future that will assist in some of that. But we're also aware that there is much about this new cohort of youth that we don't know. We can make assumptions about some of the youth that will present for service, but we also expect that there will be some youth we did not predict. And so once we have a better sense of who the youth are, why they're presenting for service, what types of placements are best suited to their needs, I think then we will have a better sense of the type of appropriate programs. We are hearing from some societies that they are thinking forward in terms of building on current placements and so on, current programming. But this will be a work in progress, and we will learn as we go about how to best meet the needs of these youth.
Thank you. I think we have one more coming from Suzanne Galloway. Hello, Suzanne. How does this tool relate to other tools in use for assessment within the homelessness sector, the DAT, VAT, etc.?
I think that question's for David.
I think it is too.
You sure you don't want to take that one, Lori? So yeah, the YAP tool, we need to start looking at all these tools as complementary. So the YAP tool, SPDAT, the VAT, Outcome Star, all those things, they're all complementary to each other. And so the YAP tool was built and designed specifically to integrate with SPDAT. So if you're referencing specifically the youth SPDAT or the VI SPDAT, they're There are elements where they can be totally complementary, but nuance with the YAP tool is that it digs a bit further into the family and natural supports, focus on resiliency, focus on the strength-based perspectives that, as I mentioned before, lots of organizations are using. So, you know, it does have the ability to integrate with SPDAT and with SPDAT data if so asked, but I think we need to also be looking at it as an opportunity to have that earlier on discussion around strengths and assets for young people as they transition, and that's why it's such an important tool, and sort of where I feel the next step is for our work and partnership with Child Intervention is that it does begin to tell us uniformly what those strengths and assets are and what we need to work on and build on pre-transition.
Wonderful, thank you. Nicole Barkley asks, and I think this is probably our last one. I work in a youth shelter. What should be our policy to contact CAS if the youth says there is no abuse? Do we just let them know that this program exists and leave it to them to decide if they want to, and then support them with this?
If you have no reason to believe that the youth is in need of protection, there's not necessarily any need to refer. But I think your idea is a good one, to inform them of a service that is available through societies. And if there is some concern that they may be in need of protection, it may be appropriate to make a referral at that point.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks so much. I think we caught all of them here. Are there any closing comments from our presenters, or except that maybe about echoes or something? I don't know. Listen, thanks so much to both of you for this wonderful, rich presentation. Lots and lots and lots of information. I think it'll give a lot of folks something to think about, and maybe contact you in future about some of the details. Also, thank you for the attachments, the supplementary materials. I think that's really, really helpful. It's always helpful to have, you know, items to be able to review and read after we've watched these. Again, note that all the registrants will be sent the recording and the slide deck, but it will also be on our website. So we have an area on our website, both in resources and community planning, where we store all our webinars. So you can go back and review any of them, see some for the first time. If this is the one you want, please feel free to share the links out as well. We want as many folks as possible to get a hold of this information. Sorry again about the echo, not sure. I'm just grateful that it only lasted part of the session. I think an hour and a half of that would have been challenging, but I want to thank COH for all their support, and Naveen for troubleshooting, and both of our participants our presenters for a wonderful, engaging presentation. And it's it's kind of a tough material because there's a lot of detail, so I really appreciate how you presented and all your time. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have a wonderful week. Take care.
Thank you.